Part 1, First Contact. The hum of the scout ship's engines filled the cramped cockpit as Commander Yarrick adjusted his position in the co-pilot's seat. His eyes kept drifting to his unusual partner, a striking Vulpini female named Lyra. Her species, known for their keen senses and exceptional tracking abilities, had always fascinated him. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of working alongside one. Lyra sat perfectly still in the pilot's chair, her large fox-like ears twitching at every sound. Her flowing silver fur shimmered under the cockpit's dim light, and her piercing green eyes seemed to catch every detail of their surroundings. The way her tail swished occasionally against the seat was oddly mesmerizing. "You're staring again, human," she said without turning her head, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "I know we're fascinating to your kind, but try to maintain some professionalism." Yarrick cleared his throat, embarrassed at being caught. "Sorry, it's just. I've never worked with a Vulpini before. The briefing didn't really prepare me for, well, you." She finally turned to face him, one eyebrow raised. "A predator species that doesn't conform to your expectations of savage warriors?" "Actually, yes," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Most non-human species I've encountered in similar roles tend to be, well, more physically imposing." Lyra's laugh was musical, though there was an edge to it. "We Vulpini prefer to use our minds rather than brute force. Though don't mistake that for weakness, human. We're quite capable of defending ourselves when necessary." The scout ship sensor suddenly pinged, drawing their attention. Lyra's ears perked up as she studied the readings. "Unusual energy signatures from the third moon," she reported, her voice becoming all business. "Consistent with the smuggler activity we're tracking." Yarrick leaned forward to examine the data. "Those readings match what intelligence provided. Looks like this tip might actually pan out." "Indeed," Lyra said, her fingers dancing across the controls. "We'll need to set down in that valley to avoid detection. The magnetic interference from the local minerals should help mask our presence." As they began their descent, Yarrick couldn't help but admire her skill at the controls. The Vulpini might not be warriors, but their reputation for precision and attention to detail was clearly well earned. The landing was perfectly executed, the scout ship touching down so gently that Yarrick barely felt it. As they powered down the engines, Lyra began gathering her survey equipment. "We'll need to proceed on foot from here," she said, checking her environmental scanner. "The target facility should be approximately 3 kilometers northeast, but this terrain will make for slow going." Yarrick nodded, double-checking his own gear. Standard issue plasma pistol, emergency beacon, and basic survival kit. He noticed Lyra carried no visible weapons, though her equipment seemed more sophisticated than his. As they exited the ship, the alien landscape stretched before them, a vista of purple-tinted rock formations and strange twisting vegetation that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the system's distant sun. "Stay close," Lyra advised as they began their trek. "This world's ecosystem is largely unexplored. There could be predators we haven't documented yet." "Worried about my safety?" Yarrick teased, trying to lighten the mood. Her green eyes flashed with something he couldn't quite read. "Merely being practical, human. I'd hate to have to explain to Command how I lost my partner on our first mission together." They moved carefully through the alien terrain, Lyra's keen senses alert for any sign of danger. Yarrick found himself increasingly impressed by her ability to spot potential hazards before they became threats: poisonous flora, unstable ground, even local wildlife that might give away their position. As the hours passed, he began to appreciate why the Vulpini were so valued for this type of work. Where a more militant species might have simply blasted their way through obstacles, Lyra's methodical approach kept them undetected and safe. "You're surprisingly quiet for a human," she commented during a brief rest. "Most of your kind can't stop talking about themselves." Yarrick shrugged. "Maybe I'm just a good listener." Besides, you're far more interesting than anything I could talk about. A slight flush colored her cheeks beneath her fine fur, though her expression remained composed. Flattery will get you nowhere, human. Though I must admit, you're not quite what I expected either. Oh? And what did you expect? The typical human male bravado, all muscles and ego, constantly trying to prove something. She studied him with those penetrating green eyes. You're different. Before Yarrick could respond, her ears suddenly swiveled forward, and she held up a hand for silence. In an instant, she was completely still, every sense focused on something beyond his human perception. Multiple contacts, she whispered. Heavy vehicles, about half a kilometer ahead. We must have gotten closer to their facility than I thought. Yarrick pulled out his tactical scanner, but it showed nothing. I don't pick up any. Trust my ears over your technology, she interrupted softly. We need to find cover. Now. They quickly moved into a narrow crevice between two towering rock formations. The space was tight, forcing them close together. Yarrick could feel the warmth of her body, smell the subtle exotic scent of her fur. Her tail brushed against his leg, and he tried very hard to focus on the potential danger rather than their intimate proximity. Part 2, The Storm. The ridge provided a perfect vantage point for surveillance. Commander Yarrick and Lyra set up their equipment, carefully positioning themselves to avoid detection. Below them, the smuggler facility buzzed with activity, grav vehicles coming and going, alien figures moving about with purpose. Lyra's ears twitched as she focused on the sounds, her Vulpini senses picking up details Yarrick's human ears could never detect. They're definitely running something big here, Lyra murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I can hear machinery, heavy equipment. This isn't just a small operation. Yarrick adjusted the settings on his scanner, trying to get a clearer reading. The energy signatures are off the charts. Whatever they're doing, it's drawing a lot of power. We need to get closer. Lyra's tail swished thoughtfully. Agreed, but we'll have to wait for nightfall. The security patrols are too frequent right now. As they settled in for the long wait, the alien sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the landscape in eerie shades of purple and blue. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Yarrick found himself shivering despite his thermal suit. Lyra, with her thick fur, seemed unaffected by the cold. She glanced at him, her green eyes narrowing slightly. You're cold, she observed, stating the obvious. Human thermal regulation isn't quite as efficient as yours, he admitted, trying to keep his teeth from chattering. Lyra made a soft, exasperated sound. Don't be ridiculous. Body heat is the most efficient solution. Before he could protest, she had pressed herself against his side, her tail curling around to drape over his legs. The warmth was immediate, and Yarrick couldn't help but relax into it. Better? She asked, her voice tinged with amusement. Much better, he replied, though he wasn't sure if it was entirely due to the warmth. Her scent was intoxicating at this proximity, something wild and exotic that made his pulse quicken. Your heart rate has increased, she noted, her tone teasing. Are you uncomfortable with our closeness, Yarrick? The way she said his name sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just, aware. Aware of what? She pressed, turning to face him. Her green eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and Yarrick found himself unable to look away. Aware of this, he said softly, gesturing between them. This attraction, whatever it is between us. Lyra's ears twitched, and her tail tightened around his legs. Finally, she breathed, you acknowledge it. Her hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing his jaw with fascinating delicacy. I was beginning to think humans were completely oblivious to subtle signals. Part 3, The Revelation. The storm had passed by the time Yarrick awoke, though the faint hum of residual electromagnetic energy still lingered in the air. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Lyra was still curled against him, her tail draped over his legs, her breathing slow and even. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply watch her, marveling at the way her silver fur caught the dim light filtering into the cave. As if sensing his gaze, Lyra stirred, her ears twitching before her green eyes fluttered open. She stretched lazily, her tail brushing against him, and then smiled, a soft, contented expression that made Jarek's heart skip a beat. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they still were. "The storm's passed. We should probably get moving." Lyra nodded, though she made no immediate move to get up. Instead, she propped herself up on one elbow, studying him with an intensity that made him slightly nervous. "Yarek," she began, her tone serious now, "there's something I need to tell you." He sat up, brushing a hand through his hair. "About last night?" "In a way," she said, her ears flattening slightly. "It's about Vulpini biology. About what last night meant." Jarek's stomach tightened. "Okay. I'm listening." Lyra took a deep breath, her tail swishing nervously. "Vulpini are adaptable. Our biology allows us to synchronize with compatible species, even across significant genetic barriers. It's how we've survived and thrived across multiple star systems." Yarek frowned, trying to process what she was saying. "Synchronize? You mean, reproduce?" "Yes," she said simply, her green eyes locking onto his. "When two souls recognize each other, as we did, our bodies respond. It's rare, but it happens. And when it does, the bond is unbreakable." Yarek felt the room tilt slightly. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that night meant more than just passion," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "My body is already changing, preparing for something I never thought possible with a human partner." Jarek's mind raced. "But it was just one night." "One night is all it takes when the connection is right," she said, her tail curling around his ankle in a gesture that was both possessive and uncertain. "I tried to tell you about this aspect of my biology last night, but you fell asleep." Despite the gravity of the moment, Yarek couldn't help but smile. "Well, someone had worn me out pretty thoroughly." Her answering smile was radiant, though it faded quickly as she continued. "But now we need to discuss what this means. In my culture, this creates a bond that cannot be broken, a mate bond. You remember what I said last night? Vulpini mate for life." Yarek nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. "And you're saying, we're bonded now?" "Yes," she said, her tail tightening around his ankle. "But I would never force you to accept such a commitment. Humans have different values, different expectations." Yarek cupped her face in his hand, studying the exotic beauty that had captured his heart so completely. "Tell me everything. What exactly are we facing here?" Part 4, Diplomatic Chaos. The days following their return to the base were a whirlwind of activity. Yarek and Lyra tried to maintain their usual routines, but the growing bond between them was impossible to ignore. Lyra's subtle changes became more pronounced, her movements slower, her senses heightened, and her appetite increasing. Yarek found himself more protective than ever, his instincts kicking in as he adjusted to the reality of their situation. Their carefully constructed facade of professionalism began to crack under the weight of their secret. During briefings, Yarek caught himself staring at Lyra more often than he should, and her tail seemed to find excuses to brush against him whenever they were near each other. Commander Thalos's antenna twitched more frequently, a sure sign that he was picking up on the tension between his two best operatives. The breaking point came during a routine mission debrief. Lyra was presenting their findings on the smuggler facility when she suddenly paused, her ears flattening and her tail stiffening. Yarek noticed immediately, his concern evident as he reached out to steady her. "Lyra? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, though her breathing was slightly labored. "I'm fine. Just a moment." Commander Thalos's antenna twitched violently. "Specialist Lyra, if you're unwell, you should report to medical immediately." "I'm fine, Commander," she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Just tired." Yarrick exchanged a glance with the Los, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The meeting continued, but the tension in the room was palpable. Later that evening, Yarrick found Lyra in her quarters, curled up on her bunk with a data pad in hand. Her tail swished lazily as she scrolled through information, but her ears perked up when he entered. "Hey," he said softly, sitting beside her. "You okay? You seemed off during the briefing." She set the data pad aside and turned to face him, her green eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I'm fine, Yarrick. Just adjusting. My body is changing faster than I expected." He reached out, brushing a hand through her silver fur. "Is there anything I can do to help?" She leaned into his touch, a soft purr rumbling in her chest. "Just being here helps. But there's something else we need to discuss." Jarek's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Elder Vera is arriving tomorrow," she said, her tone serious. "She's a high-ranking diplomat from the Vulpini Council. Her visit was supposed to be routine, but now it's not," Yarrick finished, understanding dawning. "Because of us." Lyra nodded, her tail curling around his waist. "She'll know as soon as she sees me. Vulpini can sense these things. We need to be prepared." Yarrick took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Okay. We'll handle this together. Whatever happens, we're a team." The next day, the base buzzed with activity as Elder Vera's ship arrived. Yarrick and Lyra stood with Commander Thalos and a small delegation to greet her. The Elder swept into the docking bay like a storm of silver fur and formal robes, her presence commanding immediate attention. Her sophisticated bearing made even the Los straighten in his chair. But it was her reaction to Lyra that changed everything. The Elder's nose twitched, her ears swiveling forward with sudden interest. She paused mid-stride, her golden eyes widening as they fixed on Lyra. "By the ancient dens," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. You're carrying." The room fell silent. Yarrick felt his heart stop as Lyra's ears flattened against her head, her tail curling defensively around herself.